Welcome to True Crime Chronicles Unveiled, where we dive deep into the most shocking and perplexing crimes. Today, we uncover the tragic and twisted tale of Rebecca Vance, a beloved schoolteacher whose seemingly perfect life hid dark secrets that ultimately led to her brutal murder. It was a warm spring morning in 2019 when Libby Harrison decided to drop by the Vance household. Libby, a neighbor and close friend of the family, lived just a few blocks away in Charleston, South Carolina, in the quiet South Windermere neighborhood. The Vances were well known in the area. Rebecca Vance, a 38-year-old schoolteacher, was admired by many, and her husband, Daniel Vance, a successful architect, often mingled with Charleston's elite. They had a 4-year-old daughter, Emma, who was staying with her grandparents in Charlotte, North Carolina, for a few days. It was an idyllic setup, a charming home, a successful family, but as Libby knew, things weren't always what they seemed. Libby had been friends with Rebecca for years, ever since their first meeting at a local coffee shop where Rebecca often stopped by before heading to work at James Island Elementary School. Over time, they grew close, sharing morning walks, weekend visits, and long conversations. Recently, though, Libby noticed Rebecca had grown quieter. The easy laughter and shared gossip between them had dwindled. There were also whispers in the neighborhood that the Vances marriage wasn't as perfect as it appeared. That May 3rd morning, Libby arrived at the Vance house. Something was off. The front door was ajar, just a crack, but it was enough to set off alarm bells. Rebecca was always careful about locking up. Libby stood at the doorstep, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. "Rebecca," she called out, stepping cautiously inside. Silence greeted her, a heavy, unnatural silence that made the hairs on her neck stand up. She walked into the living room, and that's when she saw it. Rebecca's body lay sprawled on the floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. Libby's breath caught in her throat. The room was chaotic, furniture overturned, Rebecca's jewelry box smashed open, its contents scattered across the floor. But it was the hammer lying near Rebecca's lifeless form, its handle stained with blood, that truly shook her. Libby's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair in her panic. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Her voice quivered as she told the operator what she had found. The minutes that followed blurred together, flashing lights, police officers, paramedics, but Libby was numb, unable to grasp that her friend was gone, and in such a brutal way. Detective Margaret Collins arrived soon after. Collins, a seasoned investigator with over a decade of experience in Charleston's homicide unit, took control of the scene. Mid-40s, sharp-eyed, and known for her relentless approach, Collins immediately suspected that this was no ordinary murder. The missing valuables, the overturned room, suggested a robbery gone wrong, but there was something off. Collins couldn't shake the feeling that the scene was too chaotic, almost as if it had been staged. Her suspicions deepened when she learned that Daniel Vance hadn't returned home the night before. He had attended a work event at the Bellman Charleston Place Hotel, a glamorous gathering of the city's top architects. His colleagues said he had stayed the night at the hotel after drinking too much, and hotel staff confirmed his stay. But Daniel's absence on the night his wife was murdered couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just bad timing, it felt calculated. Collins had her team comb through the house, collecting evidence. They dusted for fingerprints, searched for clues, and took DNA samples from the hammer. Meanwhile, Libby was taken aside for questioning, though her shock was evident. She told Collins that Rebecca had been distant lately, that her marriage to Daniel had grown cold. Their arguments had become more frequent, their time together more scarce. Rumors swirled through the neighborhood about Daniel. There were whispers of an affair, unconfirmed but hard to ignore. Collins knew that Daniel's perfect alibi would need to be re-examined closely. She wasn't ready to dismiss him as a suspect, not yet. By the end of the day, Collins had more questions than answers. The robbery theory didn't sit right, but there was no direct evidence pointing toward Daniel either. As the sun set on Charleston, the air of mystery surrounding Rebecca's murder grew thicker. Libby, still shaken, could barely fathom what had happened. What the detectives didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning of a web of secrets waiting to be unraveled. Somewhere in the chaos of that blood-stained room was a clue waiting to reveal itself. And Collins was determined to find it. The investigation was only beginning. Detective Margaret Collins sat at her desk in the Charleston Police Department, reviewing the details of Daniel Vance's alibi. It was May 4, 2019, the day after Rebecca Vance's murder, and the investigation had already raised several questions. Daniel had attended a work event the previous night at Bellman Charleston Place, a luxury hotel in downtown Charleston. His colleagues confirmed that Daniel had been drinking at the event, and hotel staff reported that he stayed overnight in one of the rooms to avoid driving home intoxicated. His alibi was airtight, at least for now. With Daniel ruled out for the time being, Collins shifted her attention to Rebecca's personal relationships. First on her list was Madison Green, the 23-year-old nanny. Madison had been living with the Vances for nearly a year, helping care for Emma while Rebecca worked at James Island Elementary School. Madison was young, energetic, and attractive, and rumors hinted that her relationship with the Vances might not have been purely professional. Collins knew she needed to dig deeper. Later that afternoon, Collins met with Madison at the Vance house. Madison, originally from Atlanta, Georgia, had come from a working-class family and moved to Charleston after high school. Her parents' divorce had left her bouncing between jobs until she found the nanny gig with the Vances. When Collins sat down with Madison, the young woman immediately explained that she had been out alone on the night of Rebecca's murder. Madison said she had gone to Kudu Coffee and Craft Beer in downtown Charleston to clear her head. The cafe staff confirmed her story, but surveillance footage told a slightly different tale. Madison had left the cafe earlier than she claimed. As Madison spoke, Collins noticed a subtle shift in her posture, a slight slouch, her fingers tapping nervously on the arm of the chair. It was a small tell, but enough to make Collins think that Madison's calm exterior might just be a mask hiding something darker. The timeline wasn't quite right, and Madison's story, once solid, was starting to crack. Collins pressed further, asking Madison more about her relationship with Rebecca. Madison kept her answers short, insisting that their relationship was professional and that Rebecca never confided in her. But Collins couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Madison spoke freely about Rebecca, but she barely mentioned Daniel. Next on Collins's list was Libby Harrison, the neighbor who had found Rebecca's body. Collins had the forensic team dust the hammer found at the crime scene, and when the results came back, they found Libby's fingerprints on the weapon. Collins met Libby at her house, a modest two-story home in the South Windermere neighborhood, just a few blocks from the Vances. Libby, still shaken, explained that she had been at the Vance house several times in the weeks leading up to Rebecca's murder. She had helped with some household repairs, which is how her fingerprints could have ended up on the hammer. But Collins wasn't convinced. Something about Libby's demeanor seemed rehearsed, as if she had practiced her answers before the detective arrived. As Collins dug into Libby's background, she learned that Libby had grown close to Daniel over the years. She had always admired him, too much, Collins thought. It wasn't just admiration, it was something more. Was it jealousy? Unrequited love? Collins began to explore the possibility that Libby's feelings for Daniel could have driven her to murder Rebecca. But as she questioned Libby, there was no solid evidence to link her to the crime. Her explanation for the fingerprints was plausible, and despite Collins's suspicions, nothing substantial had emerged. The investigation dragged on, but no matter which direction Collins turned, she kept hitting dead ends. Madison's alibi was shaky, but not completely broken. Libby's fingerprints were on the hammer, but her explanation held. Daniel's alibi remained airtight. Collins found herself at a crossroads, with no clear suspect in sight. Detective Margaret Collins was growing frustrated. It had been over a week since Rebecca Vance's murder, and the investigation was stalling. The robbery theory, which seemed solid at first, was now crumbling. Collins had sent a team to track down the stolen valuables. They found the items at a local pawn shop on Meeting Street in downtown Charleston, but something didn't sit right. After reviewing the crime scene photos again, it was becoming clear that the burglary was staged. Forensics had come back with a detailed report. The way the items were placed, the jewelry, the electronics, none of it made sense for a typical robbery. Valuables were left untouched, and the items taken were of moderate value, selected almost at random. The mess in the living room looked deliberate, as if someone had thrown things around to create the illusion of a struggle. It was haphazard, but not the kind of chaos an actual burglary would produce. Collins knew she was dealing with something more calculated. Without solid evidence pointing to Daniel or Libby, Collins felt like she had hit a dead end. Daniel's alibi checked out, and while Libby's fingerprints on the hammer raised suspicion, there was no clear motive that tied her directly to the murder. Both of them had plausible stories, and the investigation seemed stuck in place. But Collins wasn't one to give up. Something about Madison Green still didn't sit right. The Vance's 23-year-old nanny had been calm during her interview, almost too calm. There had been whispers about her relationship with Daniel, but Collins hadn't paid them much attention, until now. Collins decided to dig deeper into Madison's background. She had moved to Charleston from Atlanta, Georgia, a year ago, just after high school. She'd worked odd jobs before landing the nanny position with the Vances. Her job performance seemed solid on the surface, but rumors suggested something else was brewing. People had noticed how much time Madison spent with Daniel, especially when Rebecca wasn't around. They had been spotted together in bars, but no one had thought it was anything serious. As Collins pieced together the puzzle, something far more troubling emerged. Madison and Daniel had been entangled in a heated affair for months. It wasn't just a fling, it had begun when Rebecca and Emma were away visiting her parents in Charlotte. The late nights alone in the Vance household had created the perfect opportunity. Collins retraced the steps leading to their first sexual encounter, one that took place in the stillness of the house after midnight. Daniel had asked Madison to stay late, under the pretense of helping with a few tasks, but the charged looks and fleeting touches between them had been building for weeks. That night, with the house empty and the weight of their attraction impossible to ignore, they finally had sex. After that, their meetings became more frequent, more reckless. Madison would slip out of her room in the quiet hours after Rebecca had gone to bed, finding her way to Daniel. They had sex in the living room, the kitchen, and even in the bedroom Daniel shared with his wife. Their encounters occurred at least once or twice a week, with Madison eagerly awaiting the nights Rebecca was away or too distracted to notice. They also found refuge at Daniel's office near Folly Beach, where their secret passion continued under the guise of late-night work. Every stolen moment fed Madison's growing obsession with Daniel, making their affair harder to conceal with each passing day. Collins uncovered their text messages and emails. They revealed not only the physical side of their relationship but also Madison's spiraling obsession. She wanted Daniel for herself. She wanted Rebecca gone. One of Madison's texts to Daniel read, "I want you every night, Daniel. She doesn't love you like I do." Another message from Daniel replied, "You're the only one I can't stop thinking about. I'll find a way for us to be together." At first, Daniel seemed careful in his replies, but as Madison grew more desperate, her texts became darker. "She's in the way. We could be so happy if she wasn't here," one of her later messages read. The deeper Collins went, the clearer it became that Madison's feelings for Daniel had turned possessive. She resented Rebecca, saw her as the only thing keeping her from true happiness. And Daniel, though less emotional, was clearly trapped. The affair had gone on for too long, and both of them knew it. Collins could feel the case turning. The affair was just the beginning. Madison wasn't just a nanny caught in an affair, She was a woman obsessed, and Collins couldn't shake the feeling that this obsession had led to murder. But she needed more, something concrete to tie Madison to the crime. Just as Collins was about to call it a night, her computer pinged with a notification. It was an email from the forensics team. She clicked it open. A new piece of evidence had come in, a strand of blonde hair found in Rebecca's hand. Collins sat up, her pulse quickening. Madison was a blonde. Detective Margaret Collins had been working the Vance case for weeks, and it had started to weigh on her. The discovery of the lock of blonde hair in Rebecca's hand had provided a glimmer of hope for a breakthrough, and the DNA examination was currently underway. While Collins waited for the results, she pressed on with the investigation. During this time, Libby Harrison, the neighbor who had discovered Rebecca's body, arrived at the police station with some additional information. Collins, eager to resolve the lingering inconsistencies in Libby's story while the forensic analysis of the hair was being conducted, decided to re-interview her. As Libby sat down, she seemed more anxious than before, fidgeting with her hands. Collins reviewed her previous statements and pressed her on small details that hadn't added up, particularly the timing of when she had arrived at the Vance house and found the body. That's when Libby revealed something new. She hesitated, then admitted she thought she had seen Madison Green not far from the house that morning, just as the sun was rising. She was trying to stay hidden, Libby said. I wasn't sure it was her at first, but I've seen Madison around enough times to know. She was watching the house, and she definitely didn't want to be seen. Collins leaned forward, her interest piqued. Why didn't you mention this before? She asked. Libby seemed unsure. I didn't know what to think. It felt strange, but I figured maybe it wasn't important. I thought she was just checking in or something. This new information was unsettling. If Madison had been lurking around the house that morning, it added a new layer of suspicion. Collins had already suspected Madison's involvement, but now it seemed Madison might have been watching the aftermath of her own crime. With this in mind, Collins knew she had to dig deeper. Later that day, Collins received a tip from one of her officers that surveillance footage from a nearby home had been retrieved. The homeowner had been on vacation and only recently returned to check the cameras. Collins rushed to the Charleston Police Department's tech room to review the footage. The video was grainy but clear enough to reveal a critical detail. Madison Green was captured slipping out of the Vance house just after midnight on May 3, 2019. She was dressed in dark clothing, moving quickly and nervously, as if she didn't want to be seen. The timestamp showed her leaving shortly after Rebecca had been murdered. This was the break Collins needed. The footage didn't just place Madison at the scene, it showed her fleeing the house after the crime. Collins suspected that Madison had planned the murder, carried it out, and then left the house quickly to create the appearance that she had been elsewhere during the night. Libby's statement about seeing her near the house the following morning added further suspicion. It seemed Madison had returned to watch the events unfold from a distance. With this new evidence, Collins doubled down on her investigation. She requested a deeper forensic analysis of Madison's belongings, and the results confirmed her suspicions. Traces of blood and hair fibers matching Rebecca's were found on Madison's clothing. The physical evidence was starting to form a strong case against her. Feeling the net closing in, Collins knew it was time to confront Daniel Vance. She drove out to Folly Beach, where Daniel was working on a new architectural project. Daniel had been avoiding the media, trying to keep a low profile, but Collins wasn't about to let him dodge the investigation. She met him at his office, where she laid out the new evidence, the surveillance footage, the forensic findings, Libby's new statement, and the growing list of inconsistencies surrounding Madison's movements on the night of the murder. Daniel's face turned pale as Collins showed him the footage of Madison sneaking out of the house after midnight. He looked shaken, knowing the gravity of what was unfolding. Finally, after much hesitation, Daniel confessed to the affair. He explained how it had started as harmless flirting between him and Madison, but it quickly escalated into a full-blown sexual relationship. He admitted that they had been having sex for months, meeting late at night in the house while Rebecca was asleep or out with friends. Daniel insisted, however, that despite the intensity of their relationship, he had no idea Madison was capable of harming Rebecca. Daniel claimed that Madison had become more possessive over time, sending him obsessive messages and pushing him to leave Rebecca. He confessed to feeling trapped in the affair, unable to end it without consequences. Despite his guilt, Daniel denied having any role in the murder and insisted that he had never encouraged Madison to hurt Rebecca. Collins could see the guilt written all over him, but she wasn't convinced it was only about the affair. Collins left Daniel's office with more questions than answers. It was clear that Madison had been obsessed with him, but Daniel's role in the affair still felt murky. Had he manipulated Madison, knowing how much she adored him? Or was he just another victim of her obsession? Back at the station, Collins finally received the results of the DNA test on the lock of hair found in Rebecca's hand. As expected, it was a match for Madison. The physical evidence was mounting rapidly. Still, Collins knew she needed something more, a psychological profile, a motive that would tie everything together. Her next move was to search Madison's room at the Vance house. Collins combed through the small bedroom, looking for any signs of further incriminating evidence. That's when she found it, a diary hidden in a drawer. The pages were filled with Madison's thoughts, her growing resentment toward Rebecca, and her obsessive love for Daniel. Each entry painted a clearer picture of her mental state in the weeks leading up to the murder. One passage stood out to Collins, "She's the only thing stopping us from being happy. If she were gone, everything would be perfect." The writing became more frantic as time went on, filled with Madison's desperate fantasies of a life with Daniel, free from Rebecca's presence. It was all there, the motive, the obsession, the unraveling mental state. Madison had convinced herself that Rebecca was the only obstacle between her and a life with Daniel, and removing her seemed like the only option in her mind. Detective Margaret Collins had reached the point where all the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. She had spent weeks working on the case, and now, with the surveillance footage, the DNA results, the diary, and the forensic findings in hand, she was ready to confront Madison Green. Collins knew it wouldn't be easy, but with the mounting evidence, Madison was running out of places to hide. That morning, Collins made her way to the Charleston Police Department, where Madison had been brought in for questioning. As Collins walked through the halls, she went over everything in her mind. The surveillance footage showed Madison sneaking out of the house just after midnight, the traces of Rebecca's blood on Madison's clothing, and the obsessive diary entries detailing her hatred for Rebecca and her twisted love for Daniel. All of it led to this moment. She was ready. Madison sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, her face pale and her hands fidgeting nervously. When Collins entered, Madison glanced up but quickly averted her gaze, her discomfort palpable. Collins wasted no time and laid out the evidence, piece by piece. First, she showed her the surveillance footage of her sneaking out of the house the night of the murder. Madison shook her head, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that she had simply been out for a walk to clear her head. Collins wasn't buying it. Next, she presented the forensic evidence, the traces of Rebecca's blood and hair fibers found on Madison's clothing. Madison's denial grew more desperate. She started rambling, saying it had been an accident, that she had nothing to do with it. But Collins could see the cracks in Madison's composure starting to form. The diary came last. When Collins placed the worn, handwritten pages in front of her, Madison's face fell. She knew she had no way out. Collins began reading excerpts aloud, obsessive fantasies about Daniel, hateful words about Rebecca. Madison's hands trembled as she heard her own words, her obsession fully exposed. Collins pressed harder, laying it all out clearly. Madison had wanted Rebecca out of the way so she could have Daniel to herself, and she had planned the murder with that in mind. At first, Madison continued to deny everything, her voice shaky and broken. But as Collins pressed further, The room seemed to close in on Madison. She could no longer keep up the facade. Finally, in a moment of desperation, Madison confessed. The words tumbled out, her twisted, desperate plan to get rid of Rebecca so she and Daniel could start a new life together. She admitted that she believed Daniel loved her, that they were meant to be together, and Rebecca was the only obstacle to their happiness. Madison explained that in her mind, the only way to secure her future with Daniel was to remove Rebecca from the equation permanently. Collins listened as Madison's delusion unraveled. The depth of her obsession was disturbing. She had convinced herself that Rebecca's death would free Daniel and bring them closer together, but she had completely misread the reality. Collins watched as the weight of the confession seemed to crush Madison. She sat slumped in her chair, her eyes vacant, as the realization of what she had done washed over her. With Madison's confession secured, Collins knew the case was finally reaching its conclusion. As Madison was led out of the room in handcuffs, Collins couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, though it was tempered by the tragedy of it all. Madison had been arrested and charged with first-degree murder, and Collins knew the trial would reveal the full extent of her obsession and mental instability. Meanwhile, Daniel Vance was left devastated. When he heard of Madison's confession, he was shattered. He had never imagined that his affair with Madison would lead to this, a brutal murder, the destruction of his family, and the loss of everything he had known. Though Daniel wasn't directly implicated in the murder, the fallout from the affair was swift and severe. The truth about his infidelity became public, and his professional life crumbled. He lost custody of Emma, who was placed in the care of Rebecca's parents. His architectural career suffered as clients withdrew from contracts, and he became a pariah in Charleston's social circles. Daniel tried to rebuild his life, but the guilt of what had happened weighed heavily on him. He couldn't escape the fact that his actions had indirectly led to Rebecca's death. Madison's obsession might have driven the crime, but his affair had created the conditions for it to happen. Every day, he lived with the crushing realization that he had played a role in the destruction of his family. In the final moments of the trial, Madison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The full extent of her obsession with Daniel, her mental instability, and her twisted love had been laid bare in court. The judge's decision was swift, and Madison's fate was sealed. There would be no escape from the consequences of her actions. The courtroom was silent as the judge read Madison's sentence. She stood motionless, her face a mask of resignation as she listened to the words, "Life in prison without the possibility of parole." The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, sealing her fate. Madison barely reacted, as if she had been expecting this all along. Collins, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watched as Madison was led away, knowing justice had been served, but with a lingering emptiness inside. As the case officially closed, Detective Collins reflected on everything that had happened. She had solved the case, but the emotional toll it had taken on everyone involved left a deep impact. Collins had seen cases of obsession and jealousy before, but this one had unfolded in a way that left lasting scars. Unchecked desires and obsessions, she realized, could push people to unimaginable lengths, turning lives upside down and ending in tragedy. The murder of Rebecca Vance was solved, but the damage it left behind would remain for years to come. Collins left the station that evening, knowing that while justice had been served, the emotional wounds for those involved would never fully heal.